All right. Well, we're back with interview number two. Apologies for the dogs in the background. They've decided to play. But Jared, to start us off, unrelated, I guess, but also related, with the 250th approaching, this is a big year for the Marine Corps. And in our conversation last time, and even in the memoir that you write, where you mentioned the readings and the research that you had done that led you to the Marine Corps, is there a favorite time period, battle that you like to study and look back on, or even something that you experienced yourself of the Marine Corps' history and heritage?
In terms of studying, I mean, I think most Marines who are paying attention to its history really look at World War II as sort of the peak of its experience or of its history. Prior to World War II, prior to World War One, its history is somewhat vague and nebulous. Its involvement in things aside from, in 19th century Marine Corps history is sort of obscure, and they're not directly involved with a lot. But World War One, Battle of Belleau Wood, obviously, and the Second Marine Expeditionary Brigade, and World War Two in particular, I was always a real big fan of. Later on, I got interested in Tarawa. As a story, just from a storytelling aspect, it's self-contained in a very short amount of time, 3 days, just a little over 3 days, and it's like I believe it's the first since November of 43. It's not the first opposed landing in like amphibious history. I think that honor goes to the Army at North Africa to some extent, though it was mildly contested. Um, it's also Tara was just really ugly. It's one of the first contested in the theater, and it was a particularly ugly fight. Just the mistake with the knee tight and the Higgins boats bouncing into the coral reef, and those guys having to wade ashore. And so I did a lot of research for that. I had an interest in writing something about it some years ago, and it's got some interesting characters in it. Guys like David Shoup,
Oh,
who goes on to
absolutely.
become commandant later on. I can almost put actors to play them. I've always thought Kyle Chandler would play a really good David Shoup, uh, and his whole issue and doubt quote, statement, his radio message back to Julian Smith, back to the division commander, and then of course you had guys like what's his name, the Hawkins, the lieutenant
Oh,
who
yeah, the Scout Sniper Platoon,
the
right?
Scout Sniper platoon who they take the pier, and then they get inland, and then Hawkins gets wounded and dies not long after that. You know, Hawkins, Bonnyman,
Oh, the
and
first recorded Medal of Honor action in U.S. history.
right, Norm Hatch shot that.
Yep.
Like Norm Hatch and his combat cameraman shot that footage. And then you got Robert Sherrod doing his wartime court. He was there as well. He wrote a great book on it, and so yeah, it's just an interesting battle. Plus, it's my sort of Marine Corps alma mater, so to speak. Second Marine Division,
Yes, sir.
where I spent most of my time or a lot of my time, and so it's just a fascinating battle. And but Vietnam, also is a big touchstone for me. I think that you know I always kind of liked 68 on. Things like Waste City was an interesting period, interesting battle to study, but also the more obscure campaigns. Dewey Canyon up in the
Yes.
Asheville Valley is interesting because it sort of leads into Hamburger Hill, which happens later that year, I believe. And you got things like that. You've got the Anwa area, Arizona Territory, Charlie Ridge.
Oh, definitely. That's big
Jim,
Fifth Marines territory there.
yeah, fifth and seventh, yeah, and Jim Webb. That's his sort of stomping ground. That's the subject matter of that's the setting of Fields of Fire is Anwa Valley.
Fantastic novel, by the way, for those that are going to watch this.
Yeah, yeah, I read it when I was 15, and it blew the back of my head off. And then I've read it a few times since, and you know, I- and those are based off. Some of those guys are based off real people. Character Snake is based on a guy named, I believe, Davis is his name. Big, tall, fits the character pretty well. So yeah, I like as Vietnam is a subject, I kind of like the late war stuff. So the 69, 70, they're starting to wind down. They're starting to there's a certain jadedness to it. They're not sure. why they're doing the things that they're doing, and so it creates a kind of conflict within those units to the Marines to some extent. Not that they didn't take care of each other; they certainly did, but the larger big picture justifications for the conflict were found to be wanting, and it creates an interesting tension with the Marines in that period that I think is really fascinating. Um, but yeah, I think those two in particular really stood out when I was a kid, or when I was a teenager in particular, and then Tarawa a little bit later. When I was in the Marine Corps, Tarawa became interesting. In fact, there used to be I don't know if it's still there, and I doubt it is, but at the base library at Camp Lejeune, there was a diorama that somebody had made, and this is when I was in the Marine Corps. It was, you walked in, and on the right, kind of a little back into the library, somebody had made a massive diorama of I think it's basically wherever 3-2 and 2-2 land,
That
you
bird's
know,
beak
and
almost. Yep.
oh yeah, kind of a little bit in from a little bit east of there, and it's just this really ornate diorama of the seawall, and then a little bit inland, and those little figurines and stuff they planted in there. It was really neat. I don't know whatever happened to it. I'd be curious to know where it ended up, but that particular landing is just fascinating to me.
3-2, and their struggle, especially on D-Day at Tarawa, has always fascinated me. Eric Camel did a really good job of putting that out, and so did I think it's Joseph Alexander, who was a writer that wrote
Yeah, utmost
several.
savagery.
Yes, those two books were monumental. And you mentioned Tarawa, and I thought I'd grab it real quick because it's just sitting right here. But I've got a pre-war blues jacket here. You've got the original 30s, 20s, and 30s corporal chevrons here
Oh
that
wow, yeah.
are named to a Vincent Hicks who landed in the first wave with 2-8 at Tarawa. He was later on killed in
Uh-huh.
action at Saipan with the company gunny as the company gunny on D-Day there. But that's one of my monumental pieces there that I'm super proud to be able to tell the story of and the legacy, especially come Memorial Day. But no, I resonate with Tarawa because in those 3 days, and especially for what the Marine Corps stands for, when the Japanese commander said that a force couldn't take it, what, in 10,000 years, or
Yeah.
something of that nature, and
Mm.
Marines take it in 3 days. And it's also interesting, you mentioned the combat cameraman perspective of how the United States civilians reacted to the footage of Tarawa in the December and January of 43 and 44 there. I find that fascinating just to throw that in there. But you mentioned Vietnam, and I thought I'd throw this up and share it super fast as a plug, but also as an avid reader and a writer yourself, I figure this might be something you would be interested in. But this is a book that is releasing November 4th. Dennis Fisher gave me permission to share this, but he was a combat photographer in 67 and 68, and a lot of his photographs are monumental for the Marine Corps in Vietnam. He took some of the more prominent ones especially in the Tet time frame, post Way City. I don't, if memory serves me correctly, Dennis did not go to Way, but spent a lot of time on Allen Brook and a lot of the no-name operations, and worked with different
Mhm.
units throughout the First Marine Division. But plug here for Dennis. I'm very excited to read this. I interviewed him several times, but it's a unique lens into the world that you eventually sort of step into when it comes to literature on Vietnam, Iraq, very few of the combat cameramen, combat photographers, or correspondents have written about their experiences. I know you have, and hopefully others are getting there. I know Kevin and Lou have tossed around the idea, but that's what I would love to see for your generation of veterans as we start putting more literature out there. And I know we talked about some of the struggles of that last week, but in our next question, you think about the units you've worked with, the units you've been a part of as a grunt. What unit stands out to you the most within the Marine Corps and your legacy?
Well, as an infantryman and a combat correspondent, I got to say the Third Battalion, Sixth Marine Regiment. I mean, that's I started and ended there. My time in the Marine Corps starts and ends there. When I enlisted and went to School of Infantry, I was assigned to India Company, Third Battalion, Sixth Marines, and then I was with First Platoon for about 2 years, and then I got assigned to another unit. Not long after that deployment I went on, and then when it came time to go to Iraq, I happened to be friends with a guy who was sort of picking and choosing where combat correspondents were going to end up in the division. And he contacted me, asked if I wanted to go, and I was like, yeah. And and I started looking around at. He started giving me the rundown of what battalions and where they were going to head, and he said 3-6 was headed over, and he was also headed. They were also headed to where Lou Friel, well, is evidence to the two big operations that he participated in. They were going to replace 3-2. That's Lou's battalion, and so I instantly, once I heard 3-6, that was immediate. I was that yeah, we're going there. I'm going to do my last deployment in the Marine Corps with the guys that I start with. And there wasn't too many guys. It was many years later. It was about 6-7 years later, but there was a couple. As a matter of fact, one of our sergeants, when I was on my first deployment with 3-6, he was in a second platoon, I want to say. He was our battalion gunner in our my final deployment. So that was kind of an interesting little crossing paths there. I thought it was pretty cool that some of the guys, well, at least one person that was in the unit the first time was in the unit the last time that I was there. So that they stand out the most. I'm a sixth Marine fanatic. Got my Fourragère in a little box, and my original one, that I wore. It was given to me by a very cynical corporal. I remember very distinctly at a very happenstance ceremony. It happened, I think, I would probably say November of '98. I'd gotten into the battalion earlier, that a couple weeks prior to that, and they had us march out there and out in this field in Alphas, and they did this very perfunctory ceremony where they handed out. They kind of they put like a guy had done 2 years next to a junior guy, and then back and forth, and then the senior guy would put the Fourragère on the shoulder of the. But it was really, I remember it being very much like there was a lot of beefing and griping about the whole performance of it. There was it was which was funny and somewhat disheartening, I guess, in retrospect, because you're like, you kind of want that to mean something, and the guys who were passing it out had this sort of like, yeah, you're getting this, but you're not really. You still got to earn this kind of vibe. Um, and that's being somewhat generous. But yeah, and then I that's sort of my spiritual home, is that unit.
Well, and that it perfectly leads me into our first question that is picking it back with our timeline where we left off. You graduate from Paris Island, you're an 0311, and you have the distinction of being a grunt and eventually a correspondent. But in your reflection, and I think the book does an excellent job of this, but what does being a grunt mean to you?
Well, it's one of the smaller. Oddly enough, it represents only about maybe 10% of the Marine Corps. It's not the smallest field, obviously, by no means, but it's not the predominant field. But what it means, though, is that, but the way the Marine Corps is structured, and just from a spiritual standpoint, and from its role in our military at large, it is the most important field. Everything is in service to what that guy does. Whether it's the logistics, the air power, the intelligence community, Amtrak's tanks, such as they are, even the Navy, and the Navy's role in expeditionary warfare. It all comes down to supporting that guy with a rifle in whatever city block he happens to be in, or whatever fighting hole he happens to be sitting in, or whatever beach he happens to be landing on. And that you feel that weight, and it creates a certain confidence and even a little bit of arrogance. I think a lot of infantry arrogance comes from that, just knowing that, like everything the Marine Corps does is in service to that one field, and that means a lot. And so to be a part of that was really important to me. Um, and I felt that way even then, even in my maybe less than stellar moments. That was always in the backdrop to some degree. I will admit that I wish I had been older. I think as an infantryman, I think I would have um, been a lot wiser about how I navigated that world to some degree. Because I was 18, 19 years old. 18, 19-year-olds are stupid, and on average. And so it's also why the infantry's full of them. And but I think I would have benefited from having a few years prior to that, and then have gone into the infantry, and then maybe have a little bit better perspective on a whole host of things. But it really is the center of the Marine Corps. I mean, everything is kind of in service to what the infantryman does at its best and its worst. There's a lot said for all the other MOSs, and they're very important. But at the end of the day, it's kind of that guy with the rifle. For the Marine Corps specifically, other services have a different tenor to that. But for the Marine Corps, it really does come down to that guy, that PFC, that lance corporal, that corporal, and that sergeant doing whatever they got to do, and everything is in service to that. And it's just it's fun to be a part of. It's stressful, in its own right, but it's a very unique experience, and both in it's how I never met an infantryman who, while having really disliked the nature of the work, they weren't proud of it at the end of the day. Marines in general obviously are proud of their service, but I think infantrymen in particular, it's just a little bit extra. One, it's a tough job to do. You're out in the middle of nowhere, you're in the woods, you're in the middle of the desert, you are a sponge to the elements. Um, Everything that goes wrong in the environment, you're going to deal with. Every creature that's existing in the environment, you're going to have to deal with. You live in the terrain. So it creates a kind of misery sometimes. Um,
The
but
suck.
at the same, you're right, yeah. And the suck has varying meanings, but one of them being the environment, also, but also the institution itself is also a part of that. And and I'll say this, I think of the two jobs I had, the two major jobs, the two umbrella careers I had in the Marine Corps, it was on a person to person level, some often more honest. It was very, it took care of itself of its own, generally speaking, not always, but you didn't see guys getting, NJP for petty stuff. Things got taken care of. Now that's not always true. It
Right.
depends on the commanders and who your leaders are. That can vary, but I just found it to be very A to B. If you were something was wrong with you, you knew about it. If you were doing well, you knew about it. Maybe not necessarily the higher up the chain, but with your immediate superiors, you kind of knew where you stood. Um, the guys I think about the most when I think back on the Marine Corps are infantrymen, either guys that I worked with as a correspondent that I covered, or guys that I was in the infantry in one capacity or another, but be it 3-6 or elsewhere. Uh, those are the guys that I think. My friends, my closest friend from the Marine Corps, he was an infantryman. And we talk. I'll talk to him later tonight. We talk probably every couple of weeks. I have friends who are correspondents, but we don't talk as often. We're not as close. Part of that's because we're usually with the infantrymen. So our friends are those people. But yeah, it's just I'm kind of rambling, but it 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 really is it, within the Marine Corps, it's distinct.
Well, and you know, definitely not rambling. That's an excellent response. But I've talked to a lot of guys when they mention prior to eventually going to their unit, the first unit, or right when they are getting out of SOI, that they would often have a veteran. Some guys that have been in the Marine Corps, I guess in the 70s and 80s, told me, they had World War II, Korea, or Vietnam veterans come talk to them about combat and what they can expect as an O3. In your time with 3-6 or any time in the Marine Corps before your combat deployment, did any veterans ever come and tell you or anyone what combat would be like from those that had been there?
No, I don't remember ever meeting anybody in any profound way that sat you down and explained the sort of facts of life of the job. You know, I mean, my SOI instructors we were that period. I mean, I went to SOI in the fall of '98, and that period in the Marine Corps was sort of very expeditionary. It wasn't, Iraq and Afghanistan were not even thought about as possibility. Well, they were considered possibilities, but never anything concrete. They were just sort of abstractions. And so big picture warfare was not really something that the Marine Corps had done a lot of prior at post Persian Gulf War. And obviously the Task Force Ripper and First, Second Marine Divisions did their breaching operations and retook Kuwait. But that was, a day or two of artillery fire and maybe some small arms exchanges and not much beyond that. Um, so a lot of the combat experience that I was exposed to were guys from Somalia, guys who had. I remember running into a guy at the Jacksonville Mall, and we got to talking outside. We were waiting on cabs, and we were smoking cigarettes. And I think he was in the Second Battalion, Second Marines, and I was brand new. Been in the Marine Corps maybe 6 months, and he explained that he was in. I think he had been to Albania on his previous deployment. And a lot of that was just sitting around in bunkers and fighting holes and maybe catching a little bit of mortar fire or RPGs somewhere. And of course, he could have been embellishing it as well. I had no way of knowing. So a lot of our combat experience and a lot of the guys who had seen combat recently or in any context really were always these sort of banana wars. The your former Yugoslavian conflicts, Bosnia, Kosovo, Albania, a little bit of Liberia, Somalia, the campaign in Somalia in 92, 93 was big. I had a squad leader school instructor who had done quite a bit in Somalia. I think he was in the 7th Marines at the time. And my platoon sergeant with 3-6, I want to say he was a Persian Gulf veteran. I don't know that he went to Somalia, but he had done some other small things. Our sergeant majors were Beirut veterans. Some of our first sergeants maybe at the senior end of the first sergeant rank. Some of those guys had gone to Beirut, with some of those Marine amphibious units. Persian Gulf War was obviously the big one. We still talked about Vietnam, but it was hazy. It was very, you know, wars in the Marine Corps have a tendency in lore sort of take on these sort of mythic proportions, either on the it's always super dramatic and very like I said, mythic and very almost it's almost like a it's almost like a Lord of the Rings sort of thing, where you got to go to across Mordor. It takes on these very mythic proportions, and so it was always hard to take some of it seriously. I knew the history of it enough to know that there was some truth in it, but at the same time, a lot of guys were kind of like, okay, we're getting a lot of, we're it's going to look like D-Day, and it's going to look like Saving Private Ryan, whatever combat is. We were always a little bit suspicious of that. At least I was. That said, I remember saying I saw Saving Private Ryan the day after I got out of boot camp, and I was like, oh, I'm in trouble. If this is my life, then I've got problems. But that was World War II. That was a very different time and place. The Vietnams, I don't think anybody anticipated Iraq, but and so in any case, by the time I get on to my second time with the battalion, it's it's now, Battle of Fallujah is taking place. This is 05, 06 was when I was there. And so now we have a very A to B relationship with combat. We have a sort of, I can go, I mean, I was going to like the gym and seeing guys that I had seen at Bethesda some months before who had been wounded at Nasiriyah, you know, and now they're at the gym lifting weights. They're in 1-8 or 3-2. 3-2 had a bad time in Nasiriyah. And or no, I'm sorry, it's three. I can't remember the names of which battalions they were, but there was a particular battalion that had a hard 1-2. Excuse me, it was 1-2 that had a particularly bad time. But and I met one of their sergeants who had been wounded by an errant A-10, strafed the Marine convoy, and a guy named Torres, I believe his name was. And I met Torres in the hospital, and then I ran into him, before I went to Iraq, and him and I had a couple of conversations. So you got guys you're working with who have been under fire in very, very austere situations. In fact, I remember when I went back to 3-6, right as I was checking into the unit, a sergeant that I knew that I went to SOI with, he was checking into my battalion when I was with the base battalion at Lejeune at the time. He um, he had just done a deployment with 3-6 to Afghanistan and lost a couple of guys. And he sat me down and sort of told me what his experiences were in Afghanistan. And this is when Afghanistan was like the backwater. It was Afghan nobody was talking about it. My best friend in Iraq had been wounded on that deployment and got a NAM with Valor and a Purple Heart for chasing after some insurgents after an ID took out his truck. He's still in, he's a sergeant major now. But so you met people who you were deploying with who had been in combat. And so you got a lot of direct exposure to, you didn't need to go back to a veteran from Vietnam or World War II. And I think even those guys, and I might be overstating it a little bit, I think even those guys, there was a like almost a power dynamic shift. It was like all of a sudden they were kind of the guys who we looked up to, and then suddenly now we're the guys that are fighting the wars and seeing combat, in a contemporary sense, in a modern sense. And so we were now a lot of those combat veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan were suddenly the spokespeople for war. And in talking to guys who hadn't been in combat, which I hadn't been in before I went over there, before I went to Iraq. And so the guys, I was talking to Lance Corporals about combat as a sergeant and getting the news on it.
Well, and you taking that aspect of a sergeant speaking to a lieutenant corporal, and the reason I point that out, I've had several officers, Navy Cross recipients, who ended up telling me before they either deployed to Vietnam or when they got in country, the first thing they did was, regardless of rank, is talk to the guys that had been there to understand what they could expect. And I think that that's, of course, universal with the Army too, or anyone that's got troops on the ground in country, but even getting that valuable experience or having someone to relate as well. But at the same time, outside of talking to your guys that are there, I mean, if you're in the gym working out, or even in the squad base, where if there's anywhere a TV, you can see the war happening live to an
Mhm.
extent, on the 5 o'clock in evening news. So, from your perspective, how is that, by this point in your journey, knowing that you're a correspondent that's going to be reporting on war, being able to watch war happen live on the television?
Well, I remember very vividly getting access to videos. Okay, so my second deployment was to the Horn of Africa, and it was largely an administrative role. And a couple of things I had going on. One, I had my best friend who I was in the Marines with. He had gotten out and went to work as contractor with like a counter. He was in a counter ambush team, and I had a civilian phone that was local to the country, and that I was in Djibouti, and I could call him and talk to him. He was in Mosul at the time, and so I would call him, and he would tell me about stuff that was going on. I think, in fact, at one point, I may need to confirm this, but I believe there was a time when he had to get off the phone because of a mortar attack when we were on the phone, and so I was getting live information about what he was experiencing in Mosul, and this would have been in the fall of '04, summer fall '04. At the same time, I'm getting, so a lot of those bases, the Horn of Africa in particular, Camp Lemonnier had kind of like an intranet, a network that sort of you could share files and stuff, and people were very liberal with that, and so I was getting access to people's videos that they had gathered just out in the internet of combat footage of Marines. Either it was like a rip of an AP feed, a video that the Associated Press had shot, especially later on, in this fall of '04. That's when the Battle of Fallujah takes place. But then you also have footage that's been released from the first Battle of Fallujah, which is in the spring of '04, which is often sort of forgotten about. There's two of them. There's the first one of that spring, and there's the main one, Phantom Fury, was in November. And so I'm getting, you know, footage that's within months old, just a few months old, or if not weeks, of Marines just like me in combat in these cities, in these urban environments. It had a couple of its impact on me was very oddly enough, I was envious. Um, these guys were doing something that I had enlisted the Marines to participate in some way, and I wasn't doing that. I was in a very safe, very comfortable place, and relatively speaking. Um, and I was witnessing something that was monumental. It was historic, quite frankly, and I wasn't involved in it. And so watching that and watching those Marines under fire and operating in that way caused me a lot of angst. And then I have a friend over there as well, and so I had a lot of angst about that. And so it prompted me when I got back to start immediately looking to see if I could get over there. And it took some, quite frankly, just because of the nature of public affairs, and it took some, sort of good old boy networking and that kind of stuff, which was not cool. But I had, stuff that I had to kind of do if I wanted to go over there. And thankfully I had some benefactors who were interested in, who understood my motivations. And but yeah, so watching it in that way was really stunning. And I remember this one particular video. It was actually shot by probably a mujahideen videographer. It was a video of a guy. He was putting an RPG-7 to his shoulder, getting ready to fire off a rocket at a passing convoy. I don't know if it was a Marine convoy or Army. You couldn't see it. You could only see him. And then a saw opened up on him and just uh, uh, killed him. You know, and seeing that video really just it was horrifying on one hand, because I mean, it was a real video. It wasn't something that was, it wasn't produced. And and but it was very just, it was, you kind of got the message. This is a very real thing going on. And I saw a lot of footage like that, because a lot of, there's a lot of braggadocio in the Marine Corps and in the military in general when it comes to that sort of thing. So they're sharing a lot of videos of, you get to consider the time period. This is within 2 to 3 years of 4 years of 9/11. So a lot of the
100%.
footage that's being shared around, and a lot of the, if there's footage of an Iraqi insurgent or insurgent at large getting killed, chances are guys are sharing it around and cheering it. And it's just kind of the nature of the time period.
That's the way it goes.
Not too dissimilar from the Marine. I mean, if the Marines on Tarawa or Iwo Jima or anywhere else had cell phone, camera phones, and were able to record video, you'd be
Oh,
hearing a lot of the
100% they would.
same. Yeah, absolutely, right. It's not unheard of in war, in any conflict. Same from Vietnam, and so you saw a lot of that, and it was. But as an aside, though, I remember, as an infantryman, I'd gone to an advanced leadership school. I went to infantry squad leader school, and it caused a rift with friends who had stayed in the infantry, because I was being given an opportunity to train at that high level. They kind of had an expectation that I would stay in the infantry, and I almost did, but I kind of called an audible at the last minute there. But and they were right to be upset, and because they invested some time and money into me, and I decided to kind of go a different direction. But I remember watching videos of behavior of, like suppression fire, and listening to commands that are given out, and how things are being done, that I recognized as a junior infantry leader, like what I would want to pay attention to, and be mindful of, and just try to pick up little bits and pieces here and there and plug it in, and then see if it applies when I actually do go. Some of it did, and a lot of it didn't, but it's also situational.
Well, and building off of that, and especially the last portion there, because you do have an excellent career in the Marine Corps as a grunt and, of course, as a correspondent. The book is evidence of that. But, you know, going to SOI, going to the Advanced Squad Leaders course, having your time as a grunt, um, and do you feel that that gave you an advantage over other combat correspondents and cameramen when it came to integrating with 3.6, when in country, when in that combat deployments, because you had had the grunt experience?
Well, let me address a thing here really quick before I answer that. In terms of my excellent Marine Corps, and that's a very kind statement, and I appreciate that. Let me add a caveat to that. So, as a Marine, I was very, hmm, maybe I mentioned this in the last one, but I had very much I especially as a correspondent, not so much an infantryman, but as a correspondent. Can I use profanity here?
Oh, go for it. It's the floor is yours.
Okay. As a combat correspondent, especially after maybe my first 6, 8 months when I started to understand the personalities in the field, I was on my own fucking program. Uh, I was very much a, to use some literary and art, characters from our military arts. I was very much a Hawkeye Pierce or a Hunter Thompson. I was kind of just, I kind of went to the beat of my own drum, and I kind of did things the way that I felt this should be done, irrespective of edicts from higher. So, um, it served me in certain contexts. I was awarded. I received personal awards for my work, but I also received a lot of. I grinded up against a lot of people, and I'm both proud of it and somewhat ashamed of my immaturity in some contexts. But I very much did things my own way, and
Well,
so
I'll chime in real quick, and I never do this, but your predecessors in Vietnam would be proud of that because they did the exact same. I've interviewed those correspondents, and it was beating to their own drum. And I know Bernie Bernston, who's going to watch this later, is going to be thrilled to know that that legacy continued from his time. So continue.
yeah. I had no beef with. I got to a place in my, namely as a combat correspondent, very little as an infantryman. I had a lot of respect for a lot of the guys in the infantry, and I tended to try to do the right thing there. At my age and maturity level, the best I could. But as a combat correspondent, I saw a lot of things that in the field that I just thought were what Paul Fussell would call chicken shit, and so I just kind of it would rub me the wrong way. I think I would have a very different approach to it now, but at the time, I was more hot headed about things. And but now, as a grunt going into the combat correspondent field, in fact, being a grunt going into the combat correspondent field from a combat correspondent perspective was somewhat detrimental because people who do that, who make that what's called a lap move in the Marine Corps, the perception is that you're getting out of the infantry trying to go into a field that is cushy, and so there's a lot of built-in animosity amongst professional career public affairs officials. I ran into that a little bit from some of the staff non-commissioned officers, which fueled my sort of disdain for their behavior. And now with the infantry, it was exactly the opposite. When I was in Huseba during Operation Steel Curtain, I was hunting for a rifle company to attach to, and I landed on, and it wasn't a hard choice. I landed on India Company 3-6, is my old stomping grounds. The platoon that I was with wasn't a part of that operation in full strength. They had a squad, and so I just sort of folded into second platoon. And well, what's interesting is the platoon sergeant for second platoon was Lou Friel's recruiter, a guy named Lanos. And so Lanos knew me because I knew Friel. And he was and Frank Lanos was a really nice guy. And so I say, hey, can I just run with you guys? And he's like, yeah, and so I would I just started, and I think I just sort of filtered down to one of the squads, and eventually I landed on this guy, Mike Leiborg's squad. And I remember my attitude as a combat correspondent with an infantry unit was to always the camera was a part of the job, but it was also kind of secondary. My first responsibility was to the security and the well-being of the guys that I was attached to. I was not to be a liability to them. And so when I did things with them, if we got into a firefight that was involving the squad, particularly, I exchanged fire. Occasionally I would shoot photos, but generally most of my photos I took were always in the moments in between. If we got into contact with enemy forces, I was trading rifle fire, not taking pictures. And folks can judge me on that as they see fit. Because with a few exceptions, obviously. But my responsibility there, I felt was my job there was one, getting combat footage. If I could get a good shot, which was going to be difficult to do under fire anyway, just by virtue of the angles involved in it. We weren't operating kind of open. We were operating house to house. And so most of the pictures I take are lateral down the length of a line of guys or behind them. And so, yeah, I think I have one or two pictures of Marines trading fire with the enemy or shooting at a target, but there's not a lot to see there. And so I would wait until I was in motion in other ways that would allow me to shoot photos in a safer way. But when I remember distinctly working with a Liborg squad, they had posted a security on the roof. How it kind of worked was as we went through each house, we would post a fire team on the roof of the previous house that we had just cleared, and then we'd take the two squads and go into the next house and the next on our axis of advance. And then once we posted a fire team on that roof, once we cleared the house and posted a fire team on that roof, we would bring the first squad or the first fire team back around. And then we would kind of continue. That was a cycle of it, roughly. And it changed here and there, but that was the basic idea. So, sometimes I would do things like I would post up at the gate. Like I remember that very first one of the first houses we cleared, I posted up at the gate and let Libor because he was guarding the gate. I let him get in there with your guys, get in there and manage your dudes, and I'll take this. And he does, and he goes on, and then he calls me in and we go and that night, he kind of looks over at me, and they don't know me from Steve. They don't, I'm just another sergeant who's just attached to this platoon, and as far as they're concerned, I'm just some, pogue effectively who, doesn't know his head from his ass in terms of infantry work. And so, but they saw the way that I was kind of behaving. I was clearing corners. I was stacking up and clearing rooms, and then eventually, that I remember one of those early nights when we firmed up. Mike says to me, he goes, he thanks me. He goes, "Hey, thanks for and this is in front of his guys. He said, "Thanks for covering us and doing what you're doing." And he goes, "What's your back?" And he asked me, he's like, "What's your background?" And I told him, I said, "Oh, well, I was an infantryman for 4 years. I was a grunt, it's at 311. I was in this company, and then I went on to do other things." And it was like watching a thousand light bulbs go off, because everybody kind of went, oh, okay, this is a different dude here. We're not dealing with, somebody who's just dragging his ass through. He went to MCT and now he's been getting fat behind a desk at Lejeune somewhere. He's been out in the field, he's done the work. And so after that, and I didn't have any issues, I was a sergeant and that confers some respect. But after that, I mean, if I was going to have any trouble, if there was going to be any trouble, I was going to be the last to see it. The lieutenant knew who I was, and then word kind of gets around. Like there was a kind of, you know, honor amongst thieves sort of thing about that. Like, oh, this guy's he's patched up. Like he's got his colors, so to speak, if we're to use a biker term. And and so that made it easy for me. And then years later, I remember I had a conversation with a guy. I had been looking for him actually. He had been wounded. Um, it was in a different platoon. He had been wounded. I had been in a fire. My first firefight, it was with him and a lieutenant. A driver was in one vehicle, and there was in a convoy, and I helped him feed ammo to the machine gun, because the gunner needed ammo. And why this guy Colin reached out to me over Instagram about a year ago, and he was like, "Hey, I don't know if you remember me, but I was in that vehicle," and I was like, "Whoa, I've been wondering what happened to you," because him and another guy, the gunner, got wounded by an ID a couple weeks after that, and we got on the phone. And he goes, "Yeah, I told the story all day long. You feed that ammo, and it's something very light. It's something simple. It's like it's a know nothing task. Like but they knew once they realized that I was capable of doing these things and I was contributing in that way, it stuck with them, and it really, like, I was pretty close to those guys in second platoon, that squad, for quite a while. We haven't spoken in some time now, but through the deployment, if I happen to end up in their battle position, it was like, hey, come on in, man, whatever you want to do. I mean, it was really there was a lot of camaraderie there, and I spent that whole operation with them. So we saw a lot of fighting and did a lot together, and you know, so my background in the infantry was a detriment in one respect, but in the field with the subjects, which is what we're supposed to be doing, I who we're supposed to be supporting, I found it very helpful to have been in that role.
Well, and that's incredible. And also, I figured that it definitely would have some credence with the guys in the field because, well, with the Vietnam combat correspondents and photographers I've talked to, the ones that I've interviewed, they did not have that grunt experience. And so I always ask them, well, how did you earn the trust of the grunts, considering you are an outsider? And in Nam, the guys that I've talked to, they either carried mortar rounds, they carried machine gun ammo, they carried extra ammo or rations into the field to earn that trust. And you
Yeah.
being able to jump into feeding that ammo or being able to immediately jump into their squad patrols, that's just a different level there. And Lou and Kevin told me similar anecdotes as well of how they tried to blend in and assist and earn that trust and respect there. But at the same time, man, I don't know if you've considered it, and I hope you have. As a writer, that would be an excellent addition to 3-6 literature. Would be like a unique oral history or history book from your perspective of your time with them, but also of all the guys involved that were able to witness all this unique period, I guess, in many ways, 436 and what, 0506 through Steel Curtain and
Mhm.
beyond.
Yeah.
So, in feeding into that, you mentioned your first firefight. For you, I mean, you've been in the Marine Corps for what, 5, 6 years, and now you have someone, and unless something, of course, happened in Africa. I know Kevin told me some things about non-combat deployments where combat took place, but what was your first firefight experience like from your perspective?
It was a combination. It was a lot of comedy, oddly enough. Yeah, that firefight I guess I'll frame it around the officer who was in charge of the platoon. His name is Wilkinson, and he was a former gunnery sergeant who went to MESEP and became a lieutenant. He was this big red-faced, very funny guy, though, very lighthearted, and very good at his job, very incredibly professional, and just a super guy. And so I had been in Iraq maybe 3 weeks by this point, and I attacked this platoon because I know they're going out to, literally, their job was to go out and stir up trouble in this little area, kind of at a crossroads, and south of Ubaidi and kind of a little east of this place called Sadah. And there was a battle position set up at this crossroads that was getting mortared occasionally and dealing with long range fires and that sort of thing. And he takes his platoon, and the platoon is basically what they would call a CAT team, combined arms anti-tank team, or a heavy guns platoon, basically. They stripped all the toes off of it and just put a rifle. They basically made it a mobile, like a cavalry platoon. It was like they had like 6, 7 Humvees, and they just kind of would tear ass across the wreck looking for the shit, basically. Like that was kind of their thing. And that was what the mobile assault, they're called mobile assault platoons. I think we had two of them. And so early on, that was kind of our little operating, our kinetic force before we started going in the battalion into those cities with rifle companies. And so I attached to his platoon, and I was in his vehicle, and we posted up behind this berm south of this city called Ubaidi, which was thick with insurgent activity. In fact, that's where I think Matador gets run through there. Operation Matador gets run through there, and they 325 and 32 lost a few guys. 325 in particular lost a
They get
number of guys in
hard.
that area. Yeah, that was their area. That was that place. You familiar with the name Aaron Mankin?
Yes, sir.
Okay, Aaron Mankin was wounded in that area. Uh,
Because
I,
it's interesting you mentioned that SRO officer. that is at the high school I teach at, he was a machine gunner with 2-2. And I asked him, I said, did any correspond in 0506? And I asked him, I said, do you recall any correspondence? And he said the only one he recalled was one that got blew up. He said he knew he made it, but he knew he got blew up. And,
Yeah.
I did the math on that. It's Mankin.
So yeah, I crossed paths with Macon. I knew him loosely. We were not. He was under two Meth, I think, and then he gets pushed down a division to go over, or I think he's with two Meth, but then gets assigned out in the field to cover Matador. But Friel, I think, knew him pretty well, and I knew him loosely. We had talked a little bit, but not a lot. And then yeah, he got wounded. Then I think May, I want to say. May of '05, and that was right as I was getting ready to go to Iraq. And then I ended up in the same basic area as where he got wounded. Him and those guys got, well, I think he was one of two that maybe got out of that Humvee, or the only one, or that AAV. In any case, that was where we set up our little sort of put a finger in their eye position is what we might refer to it. We just kind of create a logger behind this berm, and I remember going up on that berm with Wilkinson. There was a scout sniper team up there, and looking over and seeing the west side of Ubaidi. And there was a water tower kind of overlooking the position. And as I'm walking back down the berm to get, it was, middle of the day, probably around 2, 3 in the afternoon. That battle position had taken a few mortars. I remember hearing it. And then I remember sitting up on that berm, in fact, and having a weird Vietnam moment because you got palm trees and that sort of thing, and then a pair of a Cobra and a Huey come flying low over and I'm like, give me a break, man.
Now you need us to
Like,
have like Fortunate Son awfully playing in the
right.
background. Jeez.
Yeah, I'm just, I need to have somebody playing a transistor radio with, Jimi Hendrix playing on it somewhere or, something like that. But I remember kind of laughing about that. But as I come down the berm, we hear what sounds like a RPG-7 click off because it has a little thump to it. And I dove into this little piece of micro terrain, and I look up, and Wilkinson's running back to the truck, and he yells at me to come with him. But I don't hear the rocket go off. There's no, and it's usually pretty quick, right? You hear the thing, the tube, it leaves the tube, it's pretty fast. It's a rocket, it moves quick, and I don't hear the explosion of the rocket. So I don't know what I heard. It freaked out the lieutenant enough because he dove into the truck, and I come in behind him. Well, 5 minutes later, everybody's back to normal. We're all just sort of sitting around. We've got the doors propped open to the Humvee because we got the engine off, so the AC's off, and it's hot out. So it's we're not in the heat, the middle of summer, but we're sort of on the lingering edges of it. So it's still getting warm out, and we got our helmets propped and the doors open, and the radio man, which is the guy who contacted me, actually, he was the radio man for the vehicle. Wilkinson goes off to confer with one of his section leaders. Either it's one of his staff sergeants, I think it was. And so I move up, or I'm sorry, the radio man moves up to take the driver's seat. I move over to take the radio man's seat to get in the shade. And not long after that, and then the driver sitting in his seat, a guy named Thompson, and he had hung all these little fly strips, those little,
Yep.
so all these flies were buzzing, and
That's in
getting
the
stuck
book,
on
if I'm
there.
not mistaken.
It
Where
is, yeah.
you
He's
mentioned the fly strips and how that's like um so many flies are hanging there, and he mocks them in many ways.
Yeah, he's just counting them as a
Yep.
pastime just to kill time. And yeah, and then you hear and I had heard rounds leaving the tube in the past, just in general, just having
Right.
fired mortars and that sort of thing. And so we all kind of heard it, but nobody wanted to believe it. That Karlovsky, the gunner, standing up in his gun, and he hears something, and everybody kind of just like the sixth senses kick in, the spider senses kick in, the back of our hair kind of goes up a little bit. And we're like, did we hear that? And Karlovsky drops in the turret and he sits on his gunner strap. So he's about here. So he's behind the armor. You can't see. And then yeah, I want to say they're 60s. I don't know if they're 81s, but their rounds start landing on the platoon's position. And it wasn't just like one or two rounds. It was consistent. It was boom, boom, which is, they don't, I've not read I've read a fair amount of war literature, but they've never described that feeling of the concussion as it hits, the round hitting the earth, the way it sort of it just sort of the wave of concussion that kind of goes through the air. You can feel it in your chest, something you feel more than hear. And it's a very unnerving feeling. And later I would hear that mortar a mortar go off and know that it's in the air. And just knowing that it's in the air somewhere was very unsettling because you don't know where it's landing. And in any case, Will I happen to look across the ground and I see Wilkinson sprinting back to the truck. And he looks at me and Wolf, the radioman had closed the door. So Wolf can't hear anything. So he looks at me and tells me to get to the other side of the vehicle. And so I've got my flak jacket kind of half on, my helmet's kind of on, and none of it's buttoned up. And I'm running around the back of the Humvee in this kind of dubious fire drill, and then I got to dive into the other side. I'm laughing, and rounds are landing. Like there's a round lands, I think, as I'm running, and I'm running around the back of the Humvee, just like, and I know this is my first. This is it. This is my first time in action. Right. This is all this buildup. This is what it is. Me running around the back of a Humvee, playing musical chairs under mortar fire with my stuff hanging off. Looking like a shit sandwich, basically. I get in the Humvee, close the Humvee door. Wilson gets in the Humvee. He gets the radios he gives Wolf a hard time, then gets the radio handsets and runs them back to him in the back seat. And then we pull out, and because he wants to break contact with the platoon. He wants to get out from this beaten zone of all these rounds. And they're starting to trail off, I believe, at this point, though. The surgeons, I don't think they were smart enough to either set the base plate or knew how to maintain that micro adjustments you have to make on the mortar to stay on target because the tube is moving. As you hit it, it's the recoil is moving the tube a little bit, and so that's why we bury the base plates or try to get it into the ground as possible. And you're always making slight adjustments as you fire them, and or, you fire a few rounds and recheck your aim. But we start moving the platoon out, and then we start getting AK fire from that water tower from behind. There's a bunch of these Connex containers. And somewhere behind there or somewhere up there, they start putting AK fire, and I hear it. It wasn't like a string of it. It was controlled bursts, a couple of rounds at a time. And it's going, I hear it snapping over the Humvee. Kind of high though. It wasn't really aimed well. And I don't think it was more than one or two shooters. I don't think it was a lot, but it was, they were putting fire out. And so we circled around down this little dirt road and came back, and we were sort of facing we kind of moved somewhat southeast. And then Wilkinson had every gun in that platoon fire at the base of that water tower. And I can see it. I'm looking past Wilkinson out the window, and I'm seeing that just devastating tracer fire riddle the base of that water tower. Karwowski, the gunner, he's starting to fire the 240. He's having struggles with it, though. He's having to cycle it a lot. For whatever reason, it just wasn't working appropriately. I think it was a new gun. And this wasn't a guy that was, he did his job. He knew how to take care of that gun, and he babied that machine gun. So it was frustrating to him to have that machine gun firing and not work right. And so he's cussing. He's, bellowing out a bunch of profanity, misfired, and he's starting to, MF this, shit on that. And finally he gets it going though. He just runs a bunch of LSA through it, or what's that stuff with the weapons lube, and cycles it a few times. And then he starts getting a good rate of fire going. And then he runs out of ammo. And before he does that, though, I've got all these cans of ammunition sitting between me and the lieutenant. So I grabbed a box and I banged the lid off. I pulled all the ammo out because they hadn't, for whatever reason, they hadn't refed the box. It was as it was when they unpacked it. And so what I did, and I know that the belt needs to go in a certain way, so I ripped the whole belt out and refed it into the box so the belt would lay flat. And so all he had to do was set the box on the mount and then just pull that belt across the feed tray and then close cover and then continue firing. So I did that. And then he calls for a gun and I just banged it up again, or he calls for a box and I just bashed it up against his calf. He reached it, grabbed it, put it in the gun, and started firing and kept firing. And we maintained, I mean, he went through at least the box he had plus another one and probably a third. I remember doing it at least two times. handing him a box of ammo. So we spent a lot of ammunition shooting up that thing. And then the Mark 19 riddles it. Wolf, mind you, he's got a camera and he's shooting video of the firefight. I am trying to get him to dig that camera out of his storage unit somewhere and give it to me so I can digitize these things. I want to digitize that tape and get that footage because we start howling and cussing and hooting and hollering. Well, Wilkinson orders a ceasefire. All the guns stop, and then we circled back a little bit to the southeast to a little knoll and and set up for the night. And everybody's like in this hooting and hollering, and we're all talking about this, that, and the other. And the adrenaline's still high, and we're laughing and carrying it on and smoking. We're all covered in crap and soot and stuff, and there was a real it was this I dare call it an afterglow to it. There was this kind of like this. We're all pushing each other and having a good time. It was very communal. It was a weird feeling. It wasn't like we were hemming and hawing over the fact that we had just got mortared. We were cheering and like celebrating the fact that we just had this experience. It was very strange in retrospect. When I think back on it, I'm like, we just had a guy try to kill us with a mortar and an AK-47, kill somebody. I mean, some of our vehicles took metal from those mortar frags, and we all just kind of were laughing about it at the end of the day. We were just kind of like, you know, the unbelievable wellspring of excitement was stunning and remarkable. And I remember I took watch in that vehicle that night. And I think I talk about it in the book where I'm just kind of sitting there just in this sort of euphoria, weirdly enough, this sort of I've now just experienced this, and it was like finally I've done this thing, and I'm in a war. I'm watching A10. There was an AC-130 called into shell Ubaidi, and I'm looking over and I'm watching the rounds impact, and it was a surreal experience. It was very much one-sided. I mean, we had six machine guns and a 203 and a Mark 19. Up against two guys, maybe a guy or two with an AK. like if we did send a patrol up there and they didn't find anything up there. I think we sent a patrol up there that night because we fired flares up above it so they could see. And I have photographs of the Humvees at night behind the flare light. And
I bet that's badass.
yeah, it's a cool photograph. I can send it to you if you're interested.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, so so we sent a patrol like a fire team up there to take a look, and they didn't find them. They didn't find. I think they said they may have found some shell casings or something like that, but there was no bodies up there. They took off, and they had a great escape route because they were behind that berm and they could flee. It was a long run, but because that tower is not close to that city, but they got out of there and lived to fight another day, I'm guessing. But yeah, that was my like I said, there was more laughter than fear. I aside from the mortars, I remember when we were driving away from the mortar fire. I got to early on. It was kind of because, like I said, I had that little moment of just like getting run around the desert there, changing the seat. But once we started moving, I really wanted to get out from under that mortar fire. Just eventually I was just like, okay, enough is enough of this. Like, let's get out from underneath this. Let's get going. And it felt like it took us a while to get figured out there. Not no to no to nobody's fault. It's just kind of how it was. And so there was a fear there, obviously, but it was sort of muddy. Later on, and when I would, when there was sniper fire and mortar fire and IEDs. That's where the fear later on became very real. Early on, we were too stupid to be scared, I guess, maybe. But and it just seemed very, like I said, it was very one sided. It was so simple, and it was so, like I said, there were so many moments of just like hilarity in it, little details that you picked up on that were just like I said, Wolf's got his camera pressed up against the window, and he's shooting a footage with a camera he bought at like Best Buy, you know, and just kind of just gawking out at this whole mayhem of this firefight, such as it was. So yeah, it was surreal, very odd.
Well, and that description, it is peculiar. But I think you do a great job in the book of explaining this, especially when you mention, your inspirations, the novels you read, that the novels make war inherently attractive in many ways. And it's that peculiarity that comes in there of, you know, people's first time under fire, the oddity of it, the amount of Marines that I've talked to from Vietnam to the present that told me, they laughed their first time under combat. Lou and Kevin talked about their first time getting shot at. They
You
laughed.
laugh.
Yeah, like
Hmm.
the amount of people that have said it is overwhelmingly the majority compared to the ones that said I was fucking terrified. It was no laughter. Then you're terrified later once you have time to think about it. You're like, holy shit, someone tried to kill me.
Yeah. Well, you know what the laughter's like? It's almost like it's you're getting away with something. Like if I were gonna make a facial expression, you're almost like, oh, that's kind of how the laughter is. It's almost like, oh wow, I just got away with this.
Well,
Like I
go ahead. Well, I was going to say, there's some footage of Fallujah where you see that I don't know if it's correspondence or if it's just grunts with cameras recording their friends, but they'll be talking. You'll have a round snap by, and you'll see that exact face that you just made, and some like
yeah.
nervous laughter in the background.
So I have a story like that. There was a guy. It was three of us standing on a, and when I think about this story now, it terrifies the heck out of me. But there were three guys. We were standing on a roof looking to the south. This is in Huseba, and we're just having a cigarette, looking south. It was a gray afternoon, and I hear this snap, and then it sounded to me like an M16 had shot near me. And I looked to my right, and this kid, his name was Patton, and he bounced back about a foot. And I look at him, like, did you just shoot your rifle? Like the other guys with him, and he's like, no. He had this like because he would have been embarrassed and a negligent discharge occur, like it would have been a bad day for him. He's like, no, absolutely not. Like, but I'm like, what it was, what had happened is a sniper had shot the buttstock of his rifle, and when we realized it was the magazine pouch had fallen over and it destroyed. And it was a strange. It must have been a low caliber weapon and a low velocity weapon because it didn't. It dented the so inside the buttstock of an M16 there's a spring, and in that spring there's a little buffer, right? And it dented and destroyed the capability of that spring, that buffer. But you couldn't really tell it from the outside of the weapon all that well. You had to really look to see the dent, and then you felt it, but at first glance it just seemed like nothing happened, and he wasn't wounded or anything like that. It just destroyed his weapon, and it destroyed it in a way that it didn't fragment. There was no spalling or anything like that. It just kind of just destroyed the butt stock of the rifle. And so, but you, like I said, you wouldn't know it at first glance. It was really strange. And then it dawned on us what happened. It was like somebody shot at us. Somebody just took a round. And if you think about it from a iron sight standpoint, what do you have on a typical iron sight? You've got three things. You got the wings, and then you got that tip. Well, there's three of us standing there. He's in the center. That insurgent put that center tip right in the center of the three of us and took a shot, and it got and hit him right in the right in the bus stock, which is always held high, and so it was like right in here. And Patton, he goes white, right? He just goes white, and he just does a 180 and walks into the little room there that the stairs that led to the doesn't say a word. And me and the other guy, and I wish I could remember who this guy was. I cannot for the life of me remember his name. I would love to talk to him, but I just cannot remember his name. And we just look at each other and we have that face that, and we get lower in the wall, right? We take a, and there might be a picture of him somewhere, but there's a picture of Patton. Somebody had taken it not long, like a few minutes later, because he goes in and tells everybody what just occurred. And there's a picture of him sitting on a. Somebody had whoever owned that house had gotten a bunch of USAID rice bags, like big, massive bags of USAID rice, and he's sitting on top of it, just kind of lounging back. And somebody had found one of those little round caps that you see in the Middle East, kind of like the little round, and it's sort of bedazzled in a way. And he's sitting there with that on his head, and I don't know why. but he has this look on his face like he's working through it, like he's going through some inner thoughts, like he's ashen and his eyes are he's got 1,000 yard stare, and somebody took a photograph of him like that. And but yeah, but now when I think about that, I think about like had he just had that sniper had been if he had elevated his barrel a millimeter or
Hmm.
moved it left to right, I could have been shot. Patton could have taken a round in the neck because he was what far. I mean, it was another 3 or 4
I was
inches,
about to say,
and that'd have been it. And we would have had a very different story to tell, and a much sadder one. And or he could have hit the other guy, and sometimes so yeah, after the fact, when you think about it in retrospect, you're just like, what? Like it's really just you're like, I just stood there and was just laughing about this whole thing. That's what I just did. I just stood there and I laughed and I just got a little bit more cover and I lit a cigarette. That's what I did. And that was it. And I never thought about it much other than just remembering the story. And when I think back on it now, it's a little bit it's like what was my mind frame like? What was my what, but at the same time, what do you do? Like you can't take the moment to have an existential crisis about this. This is what's going to happen every day potentially. So you
and
kind of just have to compartmentalize it and move on.
for me, talking with, combat vets like yourself, Kevin and Lou, the Vietnam generation, the World War II guys, they've all said the same is like there's no time for a breakdown. There's no time necessarily to put everything into your head at the moment of the reality of it. Like you need a relief, you need a release of some kind, and they say that release is humor. You make it
Mhm.
that release. Like you laugh. It's just a natural reaction. And, when I started hearing that and then started, looking at documentaries or combat footage, and I started to notice that, I was like, it makes sense in many ways. Because how else do you handle the situation around you without going crazy or without bringing on, like you said, an existential crisis when you still have a job to do and you have to remain some of that and laughter's the outcome. And, you know, the way that you tell these stories are so captivating. Excellent storyteller. The
Thanks.
correspondent part lies there. It makes sense. But it got me thinking. For our last question of the day, we'll make this an easy one for you. Just kidding. Um, you know, we talked about the historical fiction novels that we read, that we still read and grew attached to. Have you ever considered writing a novel yourself, either about Marines, in World War II, Vietnam, or even taking parts of your experiences and putting them into a novel for your generation?
I have. I still would like to do something on Tarawa. I think a novel that's similar to, say, Killer Angels
Oh, that'd be phenomenal.
on Tarawa would be interesting. I had some notes on that. I think that landing could be because it's so self-contained and so short. That can make a really good space for a lot of room. There's a lot of real estate there for some interesting stories to be told about the Marine Corps and just about war. As far as my own experience, I don't know that I'll ever write again about the Iraq War. Um, because like I've done it, I guess, as part of it, but also I think that I think there are better people for that. What I think would be an interesting book, though, is I would love to write about. I think most stressful, oddly enough, the most stressful period of my life in the Marine Corps was the first 18 months. Um, but it was also the most formative. I learned a lot about myself, um, both good and bad, and it was just that my first 2 years in the Marine Corps with the India Company, I think has a. I'm a big fan of From Here to Eternity by James Jones. I think that there's a story there. I think that there's something to be said about setting a story right before 9/11 about an infantry company, its dynamics, both it's good and bad. Because we had kind of a, I had a good company commander who was unpopular, but then he sort of won us over, to a degree. I had junior NCOs who were disaffected in a large way. It wasn't, which was somewhat unusual. for that experience from when I talked to other people in other units. Um, we had a it didn't happen during my time there, but right after I left, that year I left, at the end of that year, we had a friendly fire accident that killed a guy. He got killed by an 81 on a live fire range, and then you know 9/11's a year later, but you could maneuver that in such a way where you could tell a story that sort of lives in that space and goes into a lot of things about the culture, about quite frankly masculinity. There's a lot about bad and good versions of that in that space because there's a lot of dynamics there. There's a lot of energy in a lot of different directions. The relationships and marriages, the dynamics of a military town, which they're not always the greatest.
Correct.
It's very parasitic, while also exploitative. So yeah, absolutely. I think that particular era is something that I thought a lot about writing something on.
Well, and you mentioned the masculinity. If I'm not mistaken, you wrote an article for Rolling Stones. I don't know exactly when that dabbled into some of the masculinity within the Marine Corps and the toxicity of it. That also dealt with some of the sexual harassment that does go on, and that's a conversation for later, down the
Yeah,
road if you're open to it. But
sure.
as myself, I know you asked me off the camera the other day if I was ever looking into taking what I've done into like a book, and I have. But I've also toyed with the idea myself, inexperienced as I am of writing a novel about Iwo Jima, and I have a personal connection to that. I'm very close with a lot of the guys that were there, and I feel like a lot of people know about the 28th Marines, particularly because of the flag raising, and that is
Mhm.
monumental, 100%. But there are some regiments and battalions that I feel are kind of forgotten that played equally pivotal roles in that battle that do need to be told. And I've toyed with the idea, and I've written a prologue and a chapter that I've put out to some friends of mine, some which were in the Marines, of like, hey, how does this sound? And so far, the feedback's actually been really good on it. But the current premise of what I would like to do focuses on 227, on Iwo Jima and their journey, which is a really unique battalion and regiment in general. I'm not going to geek out and take up our time here, but that's one of the things I've always wanted to do is be an author. Like you, I was inspired as a kid. I know we talked about this by a lot of those great historical fiction writers that made war attractive to me as a kid. The movies made war attractive to me. That's what I wanted to achieve, and I didn't get that. And after talking to many of you, I don't know how I would hold up, and I don't know if I want to, based on some of the real stories that people have told me on and off camera. And I'll always be thankful for those of you that were able to go to do what you did, and able to sit here and tell me these stories. But Jared, as we end out interview number two, as always, man, thank you for your service, brother, and welcome home.
Thank you so much, man. I appreciate that.
Thank you.